I'm not ever going to let you go. And it makes me think of one of my favorite lines in a song.
Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and desert you.
Oh man, did you just rickroll our listeners?
Everyone, and thanks so much for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. This is episode 16. I'm Brian Sheely.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks again, as always, everyone, for tuning in. We are finishing up our series on the fruit of the Spirit. As you know, we've been going in reverse order. We are now at the climax, at the very end.
The pinnacle of virtue.
The pinnacle of virtue, talking about love. And we only have about a 30 to 40 minute show usually. So there is clearly no way we're going to be able to cover the topic in any detail. We'll just be scratching the surface here, but there's a lot to talk about. And so let's dive right in. You have a verse for me in our Jesus Said segment. So let's get into that.
I do. John 13 and verse 34 and 35. Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So what do you think?
I find it interesting that Jesus categorizes this as a new commandment.
Yeah, I do too. What's that about?
Well, I don't know, because you go back to Leviticus, and that is pretty much what Leviticus 19, verse 18 says.
Mm-hmm.
You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Second greatest commandment.
So I don't think Jesus is inventing some brand new concept here that was never found in the Bible, but it's new to them. You know, when you re-gift something to someone and somebody had given you a gift and you turn around and give it to someone else, well, it might not be new, but it's new to you.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of loving your neighbor has been around for so long, but it's almost like they've forgotten it and he's introducing it to them again.
Yeah, and try this on. See what you think of this idea. Maybe it's not the commandment to love one another, that part of the commandment that's new, but he's turning the volume up on it and giving them a standard. And so the new commandment is to love one another as I have loved you.
I think that's really the focus here. Now that you have seen me, now that you know how much I love you, now I think you can really understand what this love for your neighbor should be all about.
You know, it's like saying love your wife or love your wife as Christ loved the church. They're like different commandments.
Well, and as Jesus is saying this, his disciples don't even know the full extent of Jesus's love yet.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure as they are going to go back to this, they will see what he was really talking about after everything is said and done and Jesus has died and was raised. I think they'll be able to go back to this and say, oh, we really understand what true love is about now. And you kind of get that picture from people like John, who was the disciple that Jesus loved, but he was very unloving sometimes.
The son of thunder.
But then you go to his writings in 1 John, and it's all about love.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about this idea of really understanding what true love is all about. And so I think specifically here, John would probably be somebody who was looking back to these words and really starting to make the connections about what Jesus was talking about. But his words in verse 35, I think, are also really important because this isn't just love for the sake of some emotional, internal state of being. This is love that is visible, and it's love that proves to people that you really are a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah, it's the singular mark here identified, the most visible thing he's identifying as to how will someone know, is that person one of Jesus' disciples?
In 1 John chapter 4, verse 20, he says, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And so it's this close, intertwined relationship between loving God and loving your neighbor. You can't have one without the other. And if you love God, you're going to love your brother. And if you love your brother, you're going to love God. But if one of those things is missing, then John says you're a liar, which that's pretty strong language. But those times when we don't show love to other people, those times when we treat people poorly, or we ignore people, or we overlook people, or we label people and write them off, that's showing that we don't really love God, which is not a connection I think we naturally make all the time.
Holding up that standard changes how you have those little interactions because you're pursuing something much bigger. And if you can't deal with someone on a very basic level that you're interacting with on social media, or somebody that pulls out in front of you, these little moments, which is where love really gets lived, start to show up in a much clearer, much more concrete way.
And I think what you said there about where love is lived, I think our natural tendency is to consider love as something that's felt. Love is felt. Love is something experienced. Love is something that I fall into. But that's not the kind of love that we see here. Love is lived. Love is a choice. It's something that we do. It's something that we have to be intentional about. And if we can look toward Jesus as our standard for love, and we can look to all the ways that he's loved us, then it makes that choice, or it makes that intention much clearer and much more obvious about what we should do and how we should treat people. But if we're just kind of floating around, reacting to all emotions and reacting to all feelings and not really being intentional about what we do, we're just asking for trouble when it comes to really making the right loving decisions in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to get into as we get a little further into this conversation. What is the place of emotion in love? But that we'll just make that a spoiler alert for the future.
Yeah, good. We'll put that on the table here for a little bit later.
Yeah.
Right now, though, let's talk about some of our favorite things.
These are a few of my favorite things.
We're going to look at one of our favorite love psalms. So we both picked out a psalm that represents love. And so let's both go through ours. I'll let you start here. What was your psalm that you chose about love?
This is one of my favorite things in the whole world. So this is appropriate. It's not just my favorite psalm. It is some of my favorite words ever spoken or written. And that is Psalm 63.
I thought you were going to pick Psalm 119 and we were going to be here for a while. But,
yeah, let's read through Psalm 119. Psalm 63 says so much in so few words. And probably my two favorite verses in the whole Bible are in this psalm, verse 1 and verse 3. And this whole psalm is just so powerful. And so to me, as I read it, it starts to articulate, what do I really want? And what is my life about? And what satisfies me at last? Why do I serve God? Why do I praise God? And so, it just articulates kind of a theme song, a theme psalm. So I'll read through the first 4 verses and then talk about them, and then maybe come back to verses 5 to 8. So in verse 1, he says, "Oh God, you are my God." Already, God, you're the one.
Yeah.
And earnestly I seek you. Or that word for earnestly is the word for dawn, when dawn is breaking. So it can mean just the strength, and probably does mean the strength of his desire in seeking God. But it would not be lost on David that he's using the word dawn here. And later on, he's going to talk about the nighttime and thinking about God at nighttime. So he goes from morning to night here. Earnestly I seek you, or the King James, I think, says, I seek you in the morning. And my soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. And he says, I've looked on you. I know who you are. I've seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and glory. He's talking about knowing who he is. And he says, because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. Why do we praise God? Because if we look at all the best things in life, God's love is better than them. In fact, if we look at life itself, which is the greatest gift he's given us, it would seem, well, what would life be without his love? And so his steadfast love, his loyal love, his chesed,
Bless you.
which is just a fun word to say. Yeah. One of those, get it from the guttural depth of your throat. His chesed, his loyal, lasting covenant love and commitment to us is better than life itself. And so as long as I live, he says, I'll bless you and I'll lift up my hands in your name. So beautiful, so powerful. And then the contrast with the desert and the arid emptiness around him strengthens even more as he starts to talk about God as a feast. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. Where do we finally find satisfaction? And I can't help but have in the background of all of this, the Ecclesiastes class I'm teaching right now, the preacher looking for satisfaction, looking for something that isn't just a breath that you can't hold on to. And where will we find satisfaction? David says, I have found it, and in the future, I will find it. That's how steady God's love is. My soul will be satisfied like the rich food that we eat. There's nothing more satisfying than some good hunks of meat, some butter, some rich cream sauce, He says, my soul is satisfied as with fat and rich food. And so, of course, we're going to praise God. We're going to remember him on our bed. We're going to meditate on him in the watches of the night. And so we sing for joy in the shadow of his wings, and our souls cling to him. And that word for cling is the word we would usually talk about in the Old Testament for a husband and wife clinging to each other. I'm not ever going to let you go. And it makes me think of one of my favorite lines in a song.
Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and desert you.
Oh man, did you just rickroll our listeners? Oh, that is definitely not one of my favorite lines in a song. No, there's a song that we sing. It's kind of a complex song, so we don't sing it all the time. Adriel used to lead it. A song that closes with, and may I never, never, never outlive my love for you. So that's my favorite psalm, one of my favorite things. And you can see how God's steadfast love, which as you taste and see, you realize it's better than anything else, creates in us a longing for him, a desire to praise him, a desire to hold on to him. Our love comes from his love. It's born of love.
My psalm for my favorite things is one that is a little bit different.
Okay.
Not in this kind of pining away for the amazing nature of God, more so love in a time of great trial. Mine is in Psalm 109. It's kind of similar in the structure, although it's situated a little bit differently. He goes on in Psalm 63 at the end to talk about those who are against him and opposed to him. That's where he starts with here in Psalm 109. He says, "Be not silent, O God of my praise, for wicked and deceitful mouths are open against me, speaking against me with lying tongues." Now, this does not sound like a love song. This does not sound like a good thing. But what he says here, I think, is really important to understand the character of David himself, because he says, "They encircled me with words of hate and attacked me without cause. In return for my love, they accuse me, but I give myself to prayer. So they reward me evil for good and hatred for my love." This is kind of an interpersonal relationship psalm. We don't know necessarily who David is talking about here, who his adversaries are, who his accusers are. But what we see here in this picture is that David is showing them love. He's showing them kindness, but they in turn are returning to him accusation and evil and hatred. And I think when we talk about love toward God, there is never any problem with God reciprocating that love. Never a problem at all. God is easy to love because God is love, and we have every reason to love him. But as we went back in Jesus's words to love our neighbor, people are not easy to love. I'm not easy to love sometimes. And that's really highlighting here the fact that love is a choice, as we mentioned, but love being a choice toward those people who actually are our enemies and who hate us and who don't want good things for us. But that doesn't absolve us or remove our responsibility for showing love to them. And so David in his psalm here is basically saying, I have shown them love, but all they want to do is show me hate in return.
One of the things that has jumped out at me reading through the Psalms is how many of the Psalms, way more than I ever expected, seem to have this early, distant echo of the heart of Christ. Doesn't this sound like Jesus?
Oh, for sure.
Just verses 3 and 4, they encircle me with words of hate and attack me without cause. In return for my love, they accuse me, but I give myself to prayer.
And then it starts to get challenging. So from verses 6 probably down to about verse 20, David kind of transitions to something that I wouldn't necessarily advocate that we emulate, but I think is a natural response to the way that he's feeling. He is wishing for his enemies to be punished and destroyed, but it makes a lot of sense why David would feel this way. In verse 12, he says, let there be none to extend kindness to him, nor any to pity his fatherless children. May his posterity be cut off. May his name be blotted out in the second generation. I want these people gone. I extended love to them. I extended kindness and goodness to them. Let no one give them kindness. And that is kind of a challenge to really wrap your mind around. But again, I would say we can all relate to that kind of feeling. And if for nothing else, he's really asking for justice to be done, which God certainly promises to those who love him, justice, and he'll take care of that. And I think that's what David is asking for justice. But then from verses 16 through 20, he's looking at all the evil things that these accusers have done in contrast to really how he's treated them. And in verse 16, he says, for he did not remember to show kindness, but pursued the poor and the needy and the brokenhearted to put them to death. He loved to curse. Let curses come upon him. He did not delight in blessing. May it be far from him. So kind of on the other side of the coin here, if you could look at somebody like David who showed love, showed goodness, showed kindness, his accusers are not that way. And we're all going to encounter people in our lives that are exactly like this, who don't show kindness, who put their hands against the poor and the needy and the brokenhearted. The kind of love that Jesus talked about throughout his ministry was all about the poor and the needy and the brokenhearted. But rather than loving them, they put them to death. And he loved to curse. Rather than loving God, he loved to curse. And so this person, whoever this accuser is exactly opposite from the way we should be. So it's a good lesson for us to see kind of the opposite of how we really should be loving.
Wow. If you would have given me 20 guesses as to the favorite psalm that you were going to pull out, I would have never picked this one.
No, for sure. And then he concludes the whole thing, though, by going back to God's love. Because he has shown love, his adversaries have not shown love, but God is the one who always shows love. And he says, but you, O God, my Lord, deal on my behalf for your name's sake, because your steadfast love is good. Deliver me. For I am poor and needy, and my heart is stricken within me. And so whenever we're faced with people in our lives who aren't showing us love, who don't care about us, who don't show us kindness, who are doing evil things to us, God is always the one who has steadfast love in abundance, ready to give it to us. Yeah. Even though we are poor and needy and our heart is broken, God and his steadfast love is there for us. And that term steadfast love shows up all throughout the Psalms.
Chesed. Let's say it together. Chesed.
Chesed.
It's everywhere.
Again, I think highlighting here all three sides of this. loving our neighbor, loving our enemy, and God's love toward us. Just here in this one place, all contrasted together. I know it's not something that normally I would have picked, but I like it just because it shows the dirty sides of love.
Ooh, yeah.
The dirty sides of
Dirty.
love.
I hope that's that. Let's not make that the title of this episode.
No.
But there's something to that phrase that you do have to get yourself dirty and walk through the muck in order to love. That's what Jesus did on the cross. You know, that's what love looks like, is dealing with the garbage that you don't usually want to deal with.
So let's get into a little bit of practical stuff, I guess, continuing in our discussion about love. What is this word all about? Because we've kind of danced around it a little bit, but there are a lot of words that in the Greek are all translated as love. But this word that we're talking about today is the word agape.
All of these words that are translated for love have a meaning that in its normal usage does have to do with emotion. The word agape has to do with loving someone, something in the heart, an affection for someone. Just like whenever you read the Hebrew word that talks about loving our neighbor, or the Hebrew word that talks about loving your God with all of your heart, you would read about that same word being used between a parent and a child in Genesis 22 and verse 2 and 25:28, between a wife and a husband, you know. But what you start to see as we read the particular literature of the Bible, and especially of the New Testament, this word for love, this agape, has to transcend emotion. And so that's why I think it's noteworthy to say, sometimes you get the feeling that this is just an abstract thing where emotion has nothing to do with agape love. And, you know, you can read through the New Testament and find that's not true. But then you read commandments like love your neighbor, love people that are beating you and mocking you and hurting people, and you realize, well, emotion isn't going to get that job done. If I'm just reacting to my emotion, I have to transcend my emotions in order to love in this way. And so the outgrowth of a heart oriented in love towards other people and towards God is a commitment to them, a commitment to their good. And that is the essence of agape, is I'm committed to you. I'm committed to every person here, just like Jesus was committed to the people who were mocking him and crucifying him. He wanted their good, and that's why he did what he did. And he could see past their motives to their worth as people. He could see into their potential. He could see into the creatures that he created and actually have compassion, affection, and commitment to them. And that's what we have to see past what people's actions and attitudes seem to say, that what kind of feelings that might naturally arise in us, and have a transcendent perspective, a higher perspective drawn from God's perspective towards each person.
I think in our own minds, sometimes we think we are lovable. We think
You are very lovable, Brian.
I'm so lovable. I love you, man. I think it's easy for us to categorize ourselves or to miss the fact that we are not lovable sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think nothing highlights that in my mind more than Romans 5, verse 8. When Paul says, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We have to recognize that we were sinners.
Yeah.
And we were enemies to God. So love is not stopped by what is. Love is something that looks out to what could be. And if God were just to look at us and say, they're my enemies, I'm not going to love them, well, then Christ wouldn't have died.
What you just said, that's awesome. I've never thought of it that way, but that speaks of love as a creative force, and you might say the creative force beyond the universe. All of creation happened because of love. You know, God is love, and his love generated a universe for creatures he loves to occupy a space with him in the garden and to live and to learn themselves to experience this kind of commitment and love themselves, which is better than life itself. His love for us, and then learning to reflect that love, gives life its substance and its meaning and its satisfaction. So yeah, not what is, but what could be. And so then our love has to be generative as well, to start to create new kinds of relationships with people who otherwise we would have no relationship with, or people who are hurting us, whatever their response is going to be. We start to generate something new in our responses towards them.
You use the word learn there when you were talking, and I think that's something that maybe we don't focus on enough, that love is something that we need to learn. Love is something that probably is not going to come naturally, at least this kind of sacrificial love that puts other people first. Love is something that we've got to learn. It's something that we need to be taught. And it's the reason why we look to the example of God and his love to us, the reason why we look to the example of Jesus and his love to us. And if you really want to know about learning to love, there's probably no better place to look than 1 Corinthians 13. Just have to mention it. We probably don't have time to get into everything. We could make a whole nother series on 1 Corinthians 13 easily.
Yeah.
But love is a lot of challenging things. Love is something that in all of these characteristics that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 13, almost every one of these things is hard. And it takes learning, and it takes avoiding our natural reactions, and it takes choosing higher things. And you're not just going to stumble into all of a sudden not being rude or not being boastful. Or not being irritable. Those kinds of behaviors, those kinds of things are born out of learning, born out of experience, born out of intentionality.
Have you ever had a phrase that you say to yourself over and over again to help you with something?
Oh, yeah.
Our third year of marriage, me and Adrian, was our hardest year for a lot of different reasons. But the biggest one, as I look back and think about it, is that the husband in this relationship needed to grow up a lot. And
that guy,
oh man, that guy is a troublemaker. But but growing up is really hard. So I was reading different books on marriage and being a better husband, but none of those books had the impact that this one phrase that you just pointed to in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5 did. Love does not insist on its own way.
Right.
The rest of the verse is amazing also. It's not rude, it's not irritable, and it's not resentful. But I just said to myself for over a year, over and over again, every time that I thought, that's not how that should have been done. That's not how that should have been said.
Right.
I went to high school in Hawaii, and I drove to school every morning back through kind of a rainforesty area. And so there was a 1-lane bridge. And on both sides of the bridge, there was a yield sign. It's not like one side had the right of way. And that is the community of the church. You get to the bridge and you're both yielding, and you say, okay, well, I'm willing to give up what I think should happen. And the other person says, well, I'm willing to, and you just work it out. You do the dance and you say, okay, well, let's do your thing. If you have a community of people who no one is insisting on their own way, it changes the whole culture.
So let's get into some practical stuff. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Ryan has been texting me almost every day about this book. This book he's been reading, and it's called The Common Rule. And I've heard a lot about this book. I have not yet read this book, but apparently there's some stuff in this book that we should talk about on this episode, at least in terms of practical ways to love God more and to love our neighbor more. So tell us a little bit about this book, The Common Rule.
It's about these 8 habits. 4 of them are habits towards loving God, and 4 of them are habits toward loving neighbor. And it's interesting that the habits themselves, as I was reading it, weren't the things that drew me to it. I'll talk about the habits in a minute, and they're good habits, but there's a million good habits. What really helped me in reading this book was the broader perspective the importance and the biblical theology behind, for instance, being with your friends and your brothers and sisters, and being in a period of rest, and being in a period of prayer. And those kinds of things really are well articulated here. But we're going to put a chart that the book has in the show notes, and it'll help you make sense of this as I talk about it. There's 4 of the habits that are weekly, 4 of the habits that are daily, 4 that are for loving neighbor, 4 that are for loving God, 4 that have to do with embracing good things, and 4 that have to do with resisting things that can pull us into distraction. So the 4 habits, I'll just break it down. Since we're talking about love, I'll break it down into habits on loving God and habits on loving neighbor. So these habits on loving God, they're habits toward opening our eyes to who God is, accepting the love he freely offers, and returning the gaze that has always been fixed on us. And the 4 habits are, first, Sabbath. That is not like bringing the Old Testament law into the New Covenant or anything like that, but recognizing, as Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man.
Yeah.
And recognizing that whenever God created the world, after 6 days, he rested. And if God by choice rested, and this is someone who doesn't need rest, someone who doesn't need anything outside themselves to renew their energy, what is that meant to teach us about rest? And so Sabbath, not as a way just of kicking back and restoring your energy, but of recognizing that you are a creature. You are not God. All those demands you have, all those people calling for your support and help, all those things that you feel you need to get done, you can stop and the world will keep turning, settling in to our place as God's beloved creation who he will provide for. So that's Sabbath. And then fasting in food or in something else. There are so many things that we need, like food, just to keep us alive. God doesn't need that. God needs nothing else. God is just God, but God is providing for us the food that keep our bodies going. And more importantly, that food is representative of the satisfaction we find in him alone. Stopping eating and just focusing completely on our dependence on God. And then praying 3 times, kneeling to pray 3 times a day. In the morning, the first thing you do, get up, kneel on the ground, finding at midday a time to kneel on the ground and pray, and then closing the day, kneeling and praying. And of course, your posture, sometime we should talk about prayer posture. Your posture is not the critical thing, but it can help change what your mindset is. And so that's been a helpful thing. I haven't been doing all of these things. Like I said, the thing for me has not been the habits themselves. It's been really thinking through my own habits in the context of Scripture as he leads through the study. But this is one that I have been doing. So I actually set an alarm for myself, and that has been really powerful. And then the 4th one on loving God is Scripture before phone. And I kind of like this. You wake up and I just put in a strategic place my Bible and try to read, not a ton, just read something, read a verse, read a chapter, and mark down the date of the chapter you read, whatever, before you pick up your phone. So those are the 4 habits of focusing on loving God. What do you think of those?
I like them. I especially like Sabbath. I just got a new pillow, and the icon on this graphic is of a pillow.
Yeah.
And I love that idea of saying no. Mm-hmm. On the chart, he puts it more toward the embracing side, embracing rest or embracing Sabbath. But I kind of view it in some ways as almost a resisting kind of way.
Yeah, I can see that.
You're doing one of the things that I find to be one of the most challenging, and that is to say no. Mm-hmm. And if you're like me and you are a yes person, you say yes to everything. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it feels almost irresponsible to say no. It feels like you are not living up to your potential to say no. Mm-hmm. But God designed rest for a very specific purpose. And I don't think we talk enough about the importance of stopping. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, saying no allows you to say yes to something else.
Sure.
Yeah, so then the 4 habits for loving neighbor are, when we think of better habits, we often think about our own self-improvement, but nothing could be further from the purpose of the common rule. These habits are meant to be practiced with others for their sake, spending meaningful time with other people, basically. And so one of the things that our modern culture, at least in my experience, has brought about is a lot of isolation. All the things just shut us off from people. And so one of the habits is, I love this so much. One is having a meal with someone else every day. That's the daily habit. And then weekly, having an hour of conversation with a friend.
Hey, check that off the box.
Yeah,
I'm doing that right now.
I thought of that. Well, I guess I should add to it the podcast time. Maybe that doesn't count. But yeah, that's really why we were drawn. I mean, one of the reasons that I think both of us were drawn to doing this is you get an hour of conversation with people that you don't always get to spend that time really talking about things that matter and sharpening iron. So that's really powerful. And he gives a lot of practical ideas for how to do this. Both of these, if you're married with kids, say, it's pretty obvious. You might want to make your most basic practice to have dinner together or breakfast together or something like that. And maybe you're single or whatever, having lunch together with someone every day or with your coworkers every day. He even talks about a friend of his that he doesn't have a lot of people in his life that he can eat with every day. So he goes to the same restaurant every day, this single guy, and he eats at the counter and he makes it a practice to interact consistently, building relationships with everybody around him and the serving staff and everybody. I thought that was kind of cool. So those are the embrace. And then the 2 resist habits on loving your neighbor are turning your phone off for a period of time. So spending 1 hour every day with your phone off. It could be the first hour of the morning, could be when you get home, making sure that dinner time has a phone off. And then curating all your media, all the constant scrolling, curating that as the 8th habit so that you can spend maybe 4 hours for the whole week with your blogs and your social media scrolling and your Netflix binging and whatever else you're going to do with your media. Just select the good stuff because there's so much that we have to choose from. Select the good stuff, set it aside. There's so many apps for saving or queuing up what you want. And you don't have to cut it all out. Keep that within a period, an evening or a couple evenings that you've set aside for it or whatever. And that lets you focus the other time on actually being with people and serving and connecting and loving them.
There's a book from Cal Newport called Digital Minimalism. And throughout the book, there's these conversations about infinity pools. Basically,
is that a Avengers thing?
Yeah. So Thanos comes in and sucks away all your time.
Did I tell you that someone came up to me after a lesson I did talking about the false ideas around the rapture and said, isn't that what Thanos did when he snapped his fingers?
But no, I mean, this whole idea of media that is on your phone, is on your TV, is always at your fingertips, that can just suck you down a rabbit hole to the point where all of your time is gone. And in the book and plenty of conversations that I've heard about this, talks about deleting things off your phone that can become infinity pools or can become these kinds of constant sources of time robbery. And taking Instagram off your phone, taking Facebook off your phone.
Absolutely.
Not to say that you never check it or that you never use those tools, but being intentional about it. And I think at least on iOS and I think on Android as well, there's the concept of screen time. So you can set limits for yourself, how much time you want to spend on anything. I think it's good. There's just so many opportunities for us to waste time. And I think the big thing I take away from this is being thoughtful about the way that you spend your time and what you do and what you don't do. And on the topic of love, that will help us love people more when we're not constantly in our own head, on our screens, disconnected from people.
Yeah.
I think the more modern technology connects us together, the more it also distances us from each other.
Yeah.
That's easily taken care of with a little bit of self-control, which I think we talked about here on this.
Yeah. I mean, we may have talked about it before. I'm sure we have. To me, by far, the two greatest needs in the church today are two things: discipleship training, development, and then relationships. I mean, that's what we see in the New Testament. That's what Jesus is describing in John 13, 34, and 35. We need to have real community in the church that people can see. Oh, that's what it was about. That's what all of this is supposed to be. It just takes time. It really does. And it takes attention. And it takes energy to have any meaningful relationship. And it's so easy for me. And I'll just be straight up. It is really easy for me to just like hole myself up in my basement with my TV or with my phone or with whatever it is. And my wife and I can hang out, and there's so much other stuff. In order for us to be like the Acts 2 church, we're going to have to take away some of this stuff so that the church isn't like a piece of the pie. It's like the hub that overlayers everything else that's happening, so that when we're going through whatever we're going through, our brothers and sisters are just part of it. We used to call it sitcom friends. You remember? And we would just say, Brian and Sherilyn, if you want to just show up, just show up. And, walk in like Kramer walking into Jerry's house, and it's just like sitcom friends, you just live your lives together. And that's what you want the church to be, because we can't make time for another series of activities to constantly take up this stuff. But we need these brotherly love relationships. And then from that, there's this core of my relationship of love with God, and that reflects outward to my relationship of love to the church and with the church. And then that reflects outward to my relationship of love to everyone else.
So the challenge for this week, let's just pull it right out of this habit list that we've been looking at and talking about over the last few minutes. So find a habit, whether it's a daily habit or a weekly habit, whether it helps draw you closer to God or whether it helps draw you closer to your neighbor. Find a habit from this list and put it into action this week and see how that affects your life.
Like it.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website at BibleGeeks.fm. You can email us. There's a link at the top of the page to send us a message if you want to get in touch. You can also follow along with us on social media. If you'd like to do that, we are /TheBibleGeeks, wherever you might find us. And until next week, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.
We're no strangers.